Yeah, I see it.
Unfortunately, I don't have it in my notes either. Because
I
down
don't
here
remember
you
what I
talked
said,
about,
yeah.
talked about the rent, so. No, that's okay. I just thought you might want to, okay. Are there any other changes or additions? Okay, could I have a motion, please, to approve the minutes?
I'll motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Motion's approved. Okay, so we will now move on to item 2A. Consideration by the Planning Commission and public testimony regarding proposed addition to the Solvang zoning ordinance pertaining to the addition of story poles and on-site noticing requirements as part of project review and approval. Can we have a staff report, please?
Thank you. Tonight we're here to review and recommend the addition of to Section 1116.4 of the Solvang zoning ordinance requiring the use of story poles and the addition of on-site noticing requirements to Section 1117.4 public hearing notices. The recommendation from staff is to review the proposed language, amending the zoning ordinance to require the use of story poles, and after discussion and review of this, that and the on-site noticing requirements, the Planning Commission would recommend the ordinance changes to Council for their review and approve this. As this is a zoning ordinance text amendment, that is the usual process where you consider the additions or the changes to the zoning ordinance, and then it moves on to Council for their consideration and approval. I decided to talk about this in sort of a who, what, where, why, when format. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with living in this part of the state. You're familiar with story poles and also on-site noticing. So the story poles that are actually available locally to look at, they exist in Buellton now. Right behind the Starbucks, there's a mixed-use proposal, and they were required to put up story poles to give a visual idea of what a project would look like to the residents. There are a number of types of story poles, and there's different requirements for story poles all over the state and the country too. So they differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of the materials used, the timing used. But the overall, this was an In-N-Out burger that I found online, and actually I can kind of see the outline of the In-N-Out burger there if you squint. So this is something that is not uncommon. You have a list in your staff report of many jurisdictions that require at this time the use of story poles. It is something that seems to be meet a timely need for Solvang for a couple of reasons that I will get into in a few minutes. So the who part of this is all the applicants that have as part of their project submitted plans that may have a visual impact. So the who, in terms of who would provide this, would be, first of all, the applicants would, at staff direction and following the zoning ordinance, would be required to construct these and leave them up for a time of a certain duration. We did an analysis of other jurisdictions and determined that at a minimum 10 days before a scheduled public hearing would be a fair and average requirement for the story poles to be on site. There are also examples here of what on-site noticing looks like. They can be fancy, they can have visuals, and they can be pretty simple, just in terms of giving some details about when the public meeting is, what the project is like, a contact in case people want to see, get additional information. And in terms of who would provide these, we've decided that it would be best for Solvang if we made it fairly simple, and we would issue the placard at the counter as part of the application process. We would fill out the needed information. We didn't we didn't intend this to be an onerous requirement, but we did feel like this would be useful for the residents to know what that looked like. So again, I touched on the when in terms of what would be required in this case, and again, it would be perhaps a 10-day requirement before a public hearing notice. So if anybody had any questions, wanted to read a staff report, they would have contact information and a little bit of information about what was coming to their neighborhood. In terms of the why are we requiring this now, or considering the requirement of this? And part of this is that Solvang has always been pretty conscious of the value of visual impacts and the power of visual impacts in a town like ours. There have been projects in the past that have been constructed, received approval. They went through the process, they had public hearings, and then the construction started, and residents were surprised at the mass, at the height, at the scale of the projects. And it seems like this would be a timely addition to our zoning ordinance at this point to give the residents and neighboring businesses a clear idea of the possible impact of a proposed project. It is also clear to us that Solvang is growing up and not necessarily out. We have not received a lot of support for annexation or expansion of our city limits. Our real estate is still of a high value, and it would not be all that surprising to see in the future tear downs and rebuilds with a greater density in mind. We are also charged with meeting a certain number of units for a housing element requirement every 5 to 7 years, and there'll be another housing cycle that will come with another set of numbers that we need to meet. So I would not be surprised to see our current height limit be under some kind of some scrutiny and analysis. So we may find that we will be growing up, in other words, and not out. And for the general public to be informed of the visual impacts of that, I think is pretty significant. It's a duty of ours as part of the transparency that the public deserves. The final issue I might add is that at this point our zoning ordinance requires us to notice property owners and property owners only. Property owners, especially in this part of the state, aren't necessarily the people who live there. So in the interest of greater transparency, what we will be making available is the information for renters or owners of other businesses to be able to be informed of projects that are coming to them and to see the possible impacts of that. So in your staff report, we have included a list of jurisdictions that we could determine require, for instance, story poles at this time. There is some draft language that I've redlined and inserted in some general language that I've redlined and inserted into the relevant zoning ordinance passages that would allow us to do this. We could require it without the change to the zoning ordinance, but I think it makes it more official and more transparent to applicants. This will be required as part of our process to put it into our zoning ordinance. We have included an example of some posting instructions from other jurisdictions and the story pole requirements from, for instance, the city of Santa Clara, but we would revise these to reflect Solvang's requirements should council approve this and we go forward with this. With that, that concludes my staff report. You may have some questions. I'm available to answer them to the best of my ability. And we also have our attorney here to assist in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Start with you, Dan. Do you have any questions or comments?
Have you guys looked into the cost of doing this to the individuals putting up these buildings or construct? It doesn't seem like there'd be a high cost, but has anyone looked into this at all or asked anyone in the construction industry if it's a major pain for them to do this, or is it something that's,
There hasn't been any kind of outreach to the construction industry to ask them. They are very familiar with this requirement, especially in this part of the state. I know the county, the city of Santa Barbara requires this, the county does, and a number of other cities do. So some of this depends on the materials of what's required and the duration. There are some that the requirements that have them go up well in advance of a public hearing notice, and so they have to be built to a more robust standards. That said, the whole point of the visual information being relayed is that it needs to reflect accurately the plans that are being proposed. So there is some input that's needed from architects and engineers to make sure that that accurately reflects the height or the scale of the building. So I'm sure that if that question is, if you think that's relevant and important to know, there'll be some comparison of the costs involved to the applicant, depending on the types of materials we use.
are you also, I mean, it's from what I'm reading here, it says they're restricted to 35 feet for commercial and residential uses. So would there be, since there's already a restriction, could we put in some language that said you don't need to do story poles if it's below a certain height?
Nope.
I mean, I guess to me the main purpose of this is to show the scale of it. I don't know. I guess maybe it could be the width of something.
Well, I think that's part of it, and if it were over 35 feet, it would have to go to Planning Commission as a modification, or even a variance. So I think what we
So we could deny it then anyway.
yeah, I think what we've just decided over the what we've found over the years is that it's the public that, this is for the larger community and the public to get an idea of what the impact may be. We saw it in the Mercantile. We saw it at the Skit Mesa. There is a lot of
People didn't realize.
people had no idea, and so they would come back to council later and say, "How did you allow this to happen?" Well, and this gives them a visual idea of what is proposed, and if they have concerns about that, then they can go on record and raise that to Planning Commission or council, depending on the reviewing body. So
is it our understanding, Bealton has this in their code? Is that why they made them do this?
they do have that in their code. They do they do it at staff consideration.
Oh, okay.
So it's always neater to have that in your zoning ordinance to give you the authority to ask for that. I think, Roy, you look like you have some things to add, maybe from your personal experience.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in that your staff already would have the power to impose the condition of putting up story poles anytime it would be necessary for adequate environmental review. So we really aren't adding a power to your staff that doesn't already exist. The reason for doing this, in my opinion, is it removes a bone of contention between applicant and staff at that level, and then staff and public at another level, which is the nobody told me, I didn't know thing. Expense-wise, I think Holly adequately covered it. We're not asking to impose any kind of application fee for a determination that you need a certain type of story pole. So we aren't creating an extra expense for that, but there will be materials, labor, and sometimes, like Holly mentioned, professionals, because sometimes it's not going to be obvious to any of us just from common sense how high it has to be or where the pole that high needs to be to accurately represent the visual impact. So it's something that if we don't have an ordinance, staff is still going to be able to do, but it's going to be messier than if we have it in place.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay.
Just one question. This would apply to all development construction in the city, not just in the TRC?
That, yes, I think that is the intent. I mean, for instance, the Mercantile is not in the TRC. There may be other projects that will come. Perhaps Nielsen's Shopping Center will have some a new vision down the road that would include taller structures. There are other vacant parcels that will have that should they be developed will certainly have visual impacts. I'm thinking of one that's a professional office parcel on 246 that has been considered over the years and actually approved for a project that never was under construction. But that will definitely make a difference in terms of how the view shed is affected. And I trust that this is a sensitive issue with the San Ynez Valley residents in general and Solvang citizens in particular. They're pretty protective of their view sheds, and I think that really motivated staff to bring this forward at this time. So yes, it would include projects outside the TRC also.
So that would include new home construction, modification of existing homes if somebody wanted to put on a second story, for example, or?
It would generally start to apply anytime a project is not exempt from CEQA. So a lot of your single-family residence upgrades, construction, if they're otherwise complying with all the codes, you probably wouldn't want to be applying a story pole concept. But there are going to be people who are going to be wanting to exceed the current height limits. And in order to evaluate those, you'd want to see a story pole. Guessing what the state's going to do is always difficult, but not within the next couple of years. But if you use the example of what they just did, which is basically say you can build 2 houses on every single family residence, if that doesn't get the state where the state wants to be in terms of how much I'll put quotes, air quotes around affordable housing there is out there. The next thing they're going to do, especially for a built-out city like Solvang, is to look at our height limitation. Exactly, they're going to try and make us build up. And so I think it's a good idea to get ready for that eventuality, just so that everybody has the correct information, and then it also will improve staff's life in terms of dealing with the public, because the notice goes out to the property owners within 300 feet. So to improve upon that, you can either have the city bear the expense of better notice or the applicant bear the expense of better notice, or, although this makes the applicant bear that expense, the story pole is going to serve as notice too, because everybody who's driving by, everybody who lives in the neighborhood is going to see it, and they're going to wonder, what the heck is that? And so they've been notified, because the pole, even without the project notice, tells them something's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, no one's going to read that in reality, but they will see the story.
No,
They'll read it once they see the story
When they see the
pole.
Yeah, then they'll see the story
Yeah.
poles. They'll say, what is going on?
Yeah.
I think there are definitely people that will read it and question it.
Yes, I do too.
Well, and I think, if you're on the development side of the table, that may be looked at as just the cost of doing business and perhaps another expense. But we represent the residents of Solvang, and I think for us to get the word out more effectively as to what is coming to town is really what we're tasked with in planning. No surprises when we can help it, and we do our legal minimum now. We do public hearing notices, but unless you're really following planning commission or council, you don't really always know what's going on in the neighborhood or what's coming to town
Plus,
until you see it.
300 feet's just not that far, and
really.
something like a big building, taller, wider, that's going to be seen from a lot further away than 300 feet is going to be an issue, I would think. And then this list you gave us of the cities that currently have this requirement, they're all in places like this. They're all beautiful places for the most part, where there's views that are important. The people who live there really are protective of their environment. That's why they move to these kinds of places, like on the seashore and the mountains. I mean, it's a great list here of places you would want to go visit, and you would want to see it looking really nice. So I think, and also in view of my last 4 years' experience on this board, I mean, there's been a lot of issues about the size of things and the height of things in particular, and a lot of people are really unhappy that they sort of found out about it too late to do anything about it. So I think it's a good idea, and I don't think it has to be as elaborate as Santa Clara County's requirements, which are pretty stringent. We might want to say something in here about add a definition of what story poles are, sort of the minimum that has to be provided.
In the application, I assume?
In the zoning codes.
So maybe a definition of story poles in the definition
Yes.
section?
Yes, I would highly recommend that. And one other thing about that is I think that the representation has to be at final grade, because that was an issue. When grading goes on, if they were to put it on the site at the original grade, and then they're going to add to the height of the land before they build the structure, it's going to be a lot taller than people thought.
Right.
So I would add the words, the story pole has to represent the height and width at final grade.
And then we can also give some further thought to, I think, which is one of your concerns, which is adding some but nots. So your basic single-family residence on a single-family residential lot that's complying with all standards.
Setbacks and height,
From
yeah.
secret review is not going to be required. Now, that was already staff's intent, but it's not specified in there. And if what we want to do is communicate, we can give some thought to that. And so you can, as a policy matter, you could limit it further if you thought it was just important in the TRC as opposed to the other commercial areas.
Actually, I was thinking just the opposite.
Yeah, me too.
But, yeah, and then I do think we want to have it apply anytime someone's going to do a subdivision, so we wouldn't miss the,
Get me as a situation.
and we're not going to have anything that big in my lifetime probably, but you might.
Does it apply to ADUs as well,
No.
or those are exempt?
Those are,
So they don't have to
Those are just
they don't have to like.
well, they have to comply with except for a limited issue on above garage
Right.
ADUs.
All right.
They have to comply with the height limitations, et cetera. So the state didn't yank that from us completely. And I'm apologizing to the tape for yammering without my microphone on, but no, so this wouldn't apply to an ADU.
How about those split lots? For example, up on, I think it's Laurel, they just approved a lot that was split for two. Is that something where they would have to put that up?
No. That, a lot split isn't the same as a subdivision. For something to qualify as a subdivision, it'd have to be 4 or more. And then I kind of think then, even though that seems kind of small, here, you'd want to have story poles, because we want to get back to, if there's 4 or more, there's going to be finished grading. Where is that going to be at the end of the finished grading? You're also going to have issues as to where you site the building pads, basically. You may not restrict exactly where it's going to go, but you might. A lot of subdivisions say, this is the known pad. And in order to evaluate those, that way you'd know where to put the story poles. So people could look at that. And then you could discuss siting. Maybe you can reduce visual impacts by building the exact same structure sited differently because of the actual topography at the site.
Well, that was one of the other things I wanted to bring up, because the current language that's proposed here doesn't say the story poles have to be on the site where the building's going to go exactly. It says they have to be placed on the site, but it doesn't say specifically where the, plan is for the finished building to be.
Okay.
And
That's-
also
yeah,
the
that's it,
grading.
that-
So it was both the siting and the grading that I thought we should reference in this language.
Is that something that we want to do at this time, is to craft the language that would go forward, to avoid
I would think so. I think we'd want to, if we want the planning commission to recommend that the council approve it, I think we'd want to have some language for them to recommend.
let's get out our pencils.
Yeah.
Because that's really my intention at this point. I have several projects that are coming, they're in the pipeline, let's say. And I think that there are some that are important to assess the visual impacts to the city before they come back to us as completed applications. That said, and for me to go forward with this, with the text amendment, we'll need to bring a recommendation to council in its full form, if possible.
When were you planning on going to the council on?
Well, it will be, I'll take that recommendation from the interim city manager.
Okay.
My understanding was that it was going to be in February, but I'm not sure, to be honest with you. So,
Well, we could still make the end of February if we had something for the February planning commission meeting.
okay, that's true. So in other words, drop back, come back with some recommendations.
Yeah, that's what I'm
to
thinking.
to this body, should it be?
It's going to be a different body.
It may be a different body. That's part of our dilemma at this point too.
Well, I think I have a personal issue with trying to draft on the fly, because it's like waiting to the last minute and then drafting, and then my work always ends up sloppier than if I slept on it.
It doesn't always leave you with the time to
May-
attend to unintended consequences.
So maybe to meet those timelines, what we consider is just listing bullet points. If the planning commission saw fit to say, we would recommend approval if the following issues were adequately addressed.
And that would be enough in your estimation to bring then that language
To the,
with those recommendations to council.
the council, yes.
So that would leave it to the council to decide whether they adequately address it or
Right.
not.
Yes,
Or they might send it back to the planning
that
commission.
could happen.
Could be,
Or they
yes.
might
Which
just
has
say,
happened.
we don't want to do it at all, we don't know.
One, as long as we're talking about wording, I'd like to suggest in the wording that you have here, that,
Microphone's not on either.
yeah, it is,
See the light. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
that in this item E2, where you've put it in red, that we start out by just rearranging sentences here, but basically starting out by saying that story poles are required, and then follow that with, if in the estimation of planning staff, they may be waived.
Oh.
So put it on a
Staff
positive
can
note
decide
that,
whether to waive it as opposed to require it.
right.
That's a good idea.
Maybe you guys just staff the opportunity to waive it, or,
Yeah,
but then that doesn't really take it out of there. They still are on the hook for people to come back and yell at them and say you require it. you
We're
didn't
used to
require
being
it."
yelled at.
Yeah, that part they can take. I
That part we can
think
take.
that's kind of more positive in the sense that it gives staff the ability to say, hey, it's in there, I don't think I can waive it, as opposed to, I am personally imposing this upon you,
Yes.
Yeah,
even though that's just wording, because
And you're
it's,
still leaving it up to staff to make the decision.
yes,
So,
yeah, which is
which is kind of
perfectly
right now.
acceptable in a zoning code. Zoning codes are allowed to be, I'm going to say imprecise, because vagueness is a constitutional concept. So a lot of us will think something's vague, and it's not in that sense. But zoning codes can be very imprecise and still be perfectly legal. But that's the minimum legal standard. So that doesn't mean you can't recommend the council do something better than that. But I do like that positive spin. So let's go back over I'll just kind of list what I heard out loud. In addition to changing that wording, we want to make sure the story poles as erected are not only on the project site, but are located such that the project itself is adequately described by the poles, both as to location and finish height.
correct.
And finish height might be the result of a grade, it might be the result of a wall, or whatever, but the idea being it's got to represent what's going to be there, so people looking at it get an idea. Do you want to say that single-family residences on single-family lots that are not going to ask for any increase in height or mass, because we do have changes in setback, et cetera, they don't have to do a story pole. So somebody who wanted to exceed the height limit might have to do a story pole. Someone who wanted to encroach into
Setback.
a setback might have to do a story pole unless staff exempted them, so the neighbors could have a chance to see what that would look like.
For existing construction,
yeah.
Yeah,
as opposed to new construction.
right.
And
Well,
would you recommend they be used for new construction?
Yes.
I would. The new construction should be required to use them, because no one will know what it's going to look like without some idea that they can get from story poles.
The issue of residential is a little bit complicated. We don't have, right now, for instance, we don't have lot coverage in
We just
single-family
have setbacks, yeah.
single-family residential, we just have setbacks. So from what I hear you saying, then if they were requesting a modification to setbacks or height, then,
Either new or existing.
or for new or existing, so they would be required to have story poles.
Yes.
But I can anticipate where somebody building a new house, two-story house with a 26-foot height, which is perfectly legal, has all the right 10-foot setbacks, but is squarely in front of another house and is going to destroy their views. I would think those people that are already there might want to say something about that.
But there's nothing they can do.
There's not really, we were talking about the discretionary where it says ministerial review, and that's the type of project that wouldn't come to a planning commission or any kind of hearing of that nature, so it would be a staff
Yeah, I could see there,
requirement.
yeah, just in the traditional places, the only times I could think of where we might have some discretionary review is in some of the specific plan areas where there's lots of view shed protection requirements in the specific plan over near lot 72.
Is there a current specific plan that covers that? I wasn't aware of that. Not going to put you on the spot, but I was trying to find them actually for a different purpose the other day. How many specific plans we have in the city
Maybe
that
I will
protect
just
our
say
design guidelines?
Maybe it was just, I think it was just an EIR of a specific plan that was voted on in that particular case. So it doesn't exist in the code
Okay.
as such, but it exists in,
So would it be, should we just leave it then that it's in estimation of the planning staff as to whether they be required or not in those
In
instances?
those instances. As long as you have a record of those requirements.
Yeah. It's
it's the only one I can think of.
Brenda has a,
Excuse me. If we do require story poles for new residential construction and that applicant fights that requirement, I mean, who does that, can they appeal
how can
it?
they appeal? Yeah.
Yeah,
Who would
There's-
that appeal, who would
there's
they
a
appeal
code
to?
section that says they can appeal any decision of planning director to the city manager, and then if they don't like what the city manager says, they can appeal that to the city council.
So we're empowered, but only to a certain
Yeah.
extent. So,
Our staff discretion is never unfettered. Someone can always appeal it. And as I understood it, it's, well, let me make sure we understand it. Do you want story poles for every single new construction of a single-family residence? Is that the recommendation? Or just where they are proposing to exceed height limitations or violate a setback?
I was thinking in terms of obstructing views of,
obstructing views, comma,
to be height.
modifications to setbacks or height. So obstructing views can be a subjective call, depending on whose view, where, when. I think the other thing to consider, although I know that there's, for instance, solar panel authority that can be called upon. There's rights,
They're
there's a
taking
right
that
to
away, too.
sunshine.
So,
Yeah, so that not that is something we necessarily want to weigh into, but I do know that there's been some case law on that too. So I leave this in the hands of the attorney.
Well, let's, yeah, it's difficult, because on the pure single-family residence house that's otherwise complying with all the zoning codes, they're categorically exempt from CEQA. So we don't have our hook for making them put up a story pole. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't craft an ordinance that says everybody who's gonna put up a single-family residence has to do a story pole. But we don't have any we don't have a view shed protection ordinance at this point. And I'm saying that because one of our jurisdictions at Hanley and Fleischman is City of Pismo Beach, and it does have view shed protection in general plan and in certain types of ordinances. So there are,
That may come up with a general plan element update, with a land use update, where that would be the perfect time to consider what are our view sheds, what do
but
we want to
can
protect?
certainly word the recommendation from the Planning Commission to the effect that we should consider language that requires story poles to protect environmentally sensitive view sheds, or something to that effect, which that's,
But in fact, from what you said, the way our city ordinance, city ordinances are written, unless there's a CEQA requirement, we can't require it anyway.
that's correct at this
So
point.
why put in any wording about it then? And
It may be that
If
that's
we
what-
wanted to do that, we'd have to go back and change
We
other
may
regulations.
over time have to do that. I mean, we haven't really reached the point in our evolution of seeing tear downs, for instance, in our existing single family residential neighborhoods. It's certainly
It's coming.
coming. With the property values being what they are in this part of the state. So what you will see is small, modest houses being torn down and big
And you
buildings being
kind
put in their
of cover
place.
that, what I was talking about when you talk about visual impacts in what you proposed. Said impacts due to massing, scale, visual impacts, or height. So
If there was, if
maybe
there's a
it's
way,
already covered.
even if there isn't, even if there's an environmental document rationale or a CEQA hook to hang this on, I believe that if there's a way to empower the planning staff to make the determinations at that time to require them, that's that is something that can be waived later, or they have an appeal process. They could go a developer who wants to do a tear down and build a huge house on a small lot could go to the city manager and say, this is burdensome.
Those
We
mini mansions and so on are a big deal in California and LA. They're a horrible problem. People are building right out to the edge of the lots, these giant
Right,
two-story
and they are
buildings.
allowed to do so by the zoning ordinance.
In the
All
neighborhood.
all this really is giving the public the information that this is coming
Yeah.
to their neighborhood soon. It's not prohibiting it. It's merely giving the larger community a tool to understand visually what will be occurring. It does not deny the project. It does not say that you can't build that big house. It gives people that information, and then they can act, if they feel like it's important to act at that point to craft an ordinance, an amendment to the zoning ordinance to discuss tear downs and what that looks like in their community. Then they can direct council. They can come to council and direct council to do that.
So I'm a little confused at this point. So we were talking about requiring story poles if someone was going to exceed height limits or
We got at least,
Encroach upon
we got at least two
setbacks.
nods on that. We didn't get more than one nod
But-
on the subsequent discussion.
Okay, so, I don't know, I think it would be really difficult to impose this on every single family residence that's gonna be built. But now I'm stuck on, what if somebody puts a second story and permanently shades their next door neighbor's solar panels?
That's a different issue.
swimming
I wasn't.
pool.
I know. I should
Well,
never
there
have
you
brought
go,
that
yeah.
up. That was a
I'm
different
like,
issue.
oh my,
And
that would be
Somehow
bad.
They just
Yes.
spend
Well, and it
$100,000
is,
cleaning it.
there has been case law about that, but that's a different
Not our
topic
issue.
for a different day.
But that's not something that we would normally address, I don't think.
No,
That's something that might be handled in the courts.
civil.
There are cities that do have, and I don't recommend doing it, but there are cities like Rancho Palos Verdes that at least used to have a lot of those issues mentioned in the code and gave staff wide, imprecise authority to stick their nose into people's designs of their decks and all those types of things for all those reasons. And those codes have been upheld. They're difficult because it's, one person's house is another person's view.
Right.
Who got there first, and if you don't own it,
So just to clarify, it sounds to me like we have under consideration zoning ordinance text amendment for commercial structures on project sites to reflect finished height and
Location.
location. And what is now still under discussion is whether or not we would require that for residential that seek modifications to setbacks and to height.
I think I saw two nods, at least, to modifications to setbacks and height.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, yes.
I believe that in terms of protecting our view shed, that may be a discussion that would happen at a later date.
Maybe
With
we
tear
could-
downs, it's a little hypothetical now. That is probably a concern that would be left for a later boards
Yeah,
to.
I think that issue's coming, but it's gonna be a few years before
so
it's
too.
but it's
It's out of the scope of what we're talking about
I
here.
think so.
It is, but I mean, if we wanted to recommend,
Have that power.
a view shed ordinance be written, and it's been a couple years, probably before your time, but we can't do something about this if we don't define what the view sheds are.
Exactly. And I think that the time to do that from a planner's perspective would probably be as part of that larger land use element update of the general plan.
That's the only time to do it, because that's the only time you'll have an adequate environmental document to justify the establishment of the view shed.
And to hire consultants to assist us in defining from a legal standpoint what a view shed is, who we're protecting, what can be required to protect that.
It gets
Best to be left.
Morro Bay's been in litigation several times over what's a tree and what's a bush. Because their view shed protection, to protect their views of oceans, was drafted in, they said where you can't plant trees. So people are planting 30-foot high bushes.
Right. You just don't trim the tree and it turns into a bush.
So,
Okay, moving on just to another thing. Talk about saying that they be erected on the site no later than 10 days before any public hearing on the project. But we don't address how long they'd have to remain in place. And I'd like to suggest that they stay in place
Until the
until
public hearing.
any appeals or
Oh, I see.
whatever,
Yeah.
the final approval of the project.
Through the completion of the appeal process.
Yeah. And for most projects, there is no appeal.
Appeal process or appeal period.
How long is the appeal period?
10 days.
Well, they
But
have
it
10
depends
days.
on how many appeals
Yeah.
there are.
Yeah,
They have 10 days to, somebody who's opposed to the decision has 10 days to file an appeal. But then
Right.
the council is in control, or the planning commission would be in control of when the hearing is set. So that could be a longer period of time. The story poles would remain up.
Because there would be another public,
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be
hearing.
it could probably 45 days. I mean, it could be that long. So, if you
That's happened.
appeal on the 10th day, then you have to get the
And
public.
At the council level, the way the code reads as far as, the council has some time limitations as to when they take action to set the hearing, but they don't have a similar time limitation on when the hearing actually takes place. So that can stretch out a little. So
okay. So what's the correct terminology there?
I don't have a better terminology than the one that was suggested. Just wanted to make sure everybody understood that if we want to include the time after the initial hearing, it should stay up, and there are logical reasons to do so. If it's going to be appealed to from planning commission to council, there's still going to be more evaluation.
Especially.
Until a determination on the project is made, a final
Final
decision,
decision.
a final
Final
decision
determination,
is
yeah.
rendered or whatever.
And we also need to discuss the noticing change. Is there any more discussion on the story poles?
I have nothing else.
So under
1117-4,
1117-4
C5.
B5, the language there, additional noticing methods. The city may also require public noticing in any manner it deems necessary or desirable, including but not limited to posted noticing on project site. Now, in the staff report, I think you said you were envisioning placards that could be filled in with the applicant, make it easy.
Yes,
Also make sure that all the information that
it's correct.
be required is there and correct.
Yes.
So do you all think this proposed language covers that adequately?
Well, I have another question on that.
Okay.
What would be the instances where we would not require the public notice. So I'm questioning the word may in there. The city may.
Well, that's additional noticing methods as opposed to the
Stuff in the newspapers.
well, the 1, 2, 3, 4 are all shalls. And so 5 is just intended to be permissible additional notice requirement. So it wouldn't be required at every single
So we should
public hearing.
excuse me, we should probably say that when storyboards are required, the noticing will be required. The additional noticing will be
We
required.
could do that. My intention was to be as broad as possible on this. We don't have any way to require any noticing other than putting it in the newspaper at this point. So if there's a project where we felt like putting an on-site noticing would suffice, but story polls were for some reason not needed,
That too.
then that gives us the flexibility to do that and still inform the larger community what may be happening on that site.
Then perhaps another sentence says, when story polls are required, the additional noticing will also be required. It will give you, in a separate sentence, the ability to put noticing in other circumstances as well, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
Or you can just use the word may, so that gives you the option instead of.
Well, it seems like if the story polls are up, then that's when everyone's gonna start looking for what is this and what's going here.
And we've already decided that we would take on the expense and the staff time and the to administer this particular requirement, but we're not burdening the applicant with I've worked in a jurisdiction where that was required by the applicant. They had to go to a certain sign company, they had to make the lettering, they had to have it there, they had to send us a photo that it showed that it was date stamped, that it was there on site that
The
10 days
county of
before.
Santa Barbara.
Yeah, and it was Healdsburg.
City of Santa Barbara, that was
I
pretty strict.
I was surprised at I thought that was
Yeah,
that was
a little onerous.
right. So our intention with this noticing was that we'd be willing to absorb the cost and to make sure that it's accurate. We want to make sure that it's posted if we give them the sign in a visible place, and we may have to get a little detailed in our application about what that would look like. But I didn't necessarily want to memorialize that in the zoning ordinance with a lot of verbiage that could hopefully be handled
Okay.
from an administrative point of view over the counter. So.
All right, are we ready for a motion?
Well, I have another question.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
On, in just putting this in here, there are no instructions to the applicant as to what they need to do and what have you. And you gave some examples like the one from Santa Clara, which, was mentioned might be a little too restrictive. What is going to be the review process for that? Who's
Well,
going to make that determination of what those instructions are?
I think like many of our applications, I don't believe that they've necessarily been brought before council or planning commission for review. We feel like we would do an adequate job of sampling other jurisdictions of this size to try to make whatever we're requiring be feasible and clear. So the usual process is not to put a lot of that detail into your zoning ordinance in terms of applications for this. This we consider to be a fairly small item compared to, for instance, a conditional use permit or what's required. We don't put a conditional use permit application in there. We tell them what's required, or why, but not the nuts and bolts of the details of what the application would look like.
Well, if I may, and if I'm understanding your question, that was why I suggested a definition of story poles be added to
Right.
the codes, because there's a definition section.
Right.
And if we
And that's-
define what we see story
Exactly.
poles are meant to be, and they don't have to be as stringent as that almost half-erected building that Santa Clara County
Exactly.
requires,
Exactly.
then you know, it's kind of like the minimum that you would do, would have to do if story poles were required. So I think the definition would cover that.
Yeah, I was just concerned that, you know, whoever's going to do that, they keep in mind that we don't want to, we've overused this term, but overburden the applicant with more and more requirements. It should be a minimalist thing.
I agree.
Kind of like the Buellton picture.
Yeah, kind of building.
Kind of like the
Yeah,
view.
that looked pretty simple.
Put flags in it. That's not too tough. We could require Christmas lights instead if we want.
Right.
It is solving.
Dark sky compliant.
But we don't have to come up with the definition today, no. But I do think one would be a
That's
very good
useful.
idea.
I agree.
More questions?
No more.
No more? Somebody
Brenda,
wanna
have you
make a-
gotten all your questions answered? Do you feel like you have enough at this point for?
I just wanted to go over one little point, was where you're adding this amendment change is under development plans. And in all of our zone districts, it dictates how we are going to process that project. So just to piggyback back on the single-family dwellings, most of the single-family dwellings are not required to have a development plan, so I really think that we should shy away from adding anything about single families in how to process a development plan.
Yep,
Just my thought.
good point. Okay. So,
There's a resolution.
can, I guess I could request a motion to approve staff recommendation with the changes we've discussed. Would that be sufficient?
Roy?
Got the bullet points?
Well, from a
Noted.
staff level, it would be, but I'll reiterate that sometimes I counted 2 nods and not 3. So I don't think we want the record to reflect 3 unless we know for sure that, I guess you could just, when you vote, you could tell us. There we go.
Well, why don't we do this? We'll approve the staff recommendation with the with the changes we discussed, and if anybody wants to eliminate one of those changes in their vote, they can do that. Would that be fair?
That works for me,
Okay,
if the staff's happy.
okay. Could I ask you to repeat the recommendations that were made? For example, give staff the ability to waive as opposed to require. Make sure that the story poles are located on the site to represent both the final location and finished height. The pole should be erected 10 days, a minimum of 10 days prior to the first public hearing, and then be retained there throughout the appeal process until final determination of the project has been made. Was that everything? And that
And add a definition
not
of story
include-
poles.
add a definition of story poles. Thank you.
Can you repeat the first item?
Reword to allow the draft language to allow staff the ability to waive a requirement for story poles as opposed to require story poles. Story poles would be required in every situation where the mass, the reasons you said, the mass and the height would be of concern to the public. Okay, so can I just say, make that a motion? I'll do
Okay,
it.
we wrote.
Okay,
I'll do it. I make the motion, we
all right.
accept with comments that were just made.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye,
Aye.
Aye.
3-1.
Okay.
3-0.
3 to none.
All right, so now.
Thank you.
I Comments from staff? Comments?
I have no comments at this time. I know that we are all following the process of appointing a council member. The meeting will be tomorrow night, ideally to determine who that individual may be. There will be an item discussing the possible merger of the Board of Architectural Review and Planning Commission into one body. There's a lot to think about with that move, and that discussion will begin, I believe, on the 14th of January with the staff report that was written by the city attorney and is making its internal rounds today, actually, to open that conversation. That's all that staff has at this point. We have a number of projects in the pipeline, but we always do. Sometimes they come to you, and sometimes they drop back. And a lot of this has to do with financing other projects that they may be interested in. We do our best to respond in a timely fashion to submittals and to give our feedback accurately. And to be available to answer any questions on any projects that we might see in the coming to town. A lot of interest in some of our remaining parcels, and we'll have a busy year, I believe. Our interim city manager should be in place for a little while yet. That process will take probably another couple of months, is my guess.
May I ask a question about the combination of the Planning Commission and the BAR?
Yes.
Have you gone out, or has anybody gone out to talk to other cities about how that works?
I have just done an informal outreach to about 8 other cities in the area, see what they do in terms of design review. Do they have a separate board? Is it an architectural review board? Is it a BAR type board? Do they have one? Don't they have one? And if they don't have one, at what point does design review occur? I've pulled together a spreadsheet and some examples of what other jurisdictions do and how they handle that, and I've submitted that to the city attorney as part of the consideration. I think the other thing that is being looked at is there are some unknown costs. There's a belief that that might save some costs. I'm not sure about that because there's some unknowns in terms of staff time and attorney time too. So we await that discussion with the new council, and we'll see what direction we are given in terms of whether or not the savings is there or streamlining. There are internal processes that could be evaluated to potentially streamline the approval process. We do have a city that values its brand, and part of that brand is certainly has a heavy emphasis on design. So anybody who would be sitting in the position to review that as a project qualification would need to be educated on what that would look like, and what we're trying to perpetuate, and how important is it to us to preserve. So it's a larger question that Solvang is having, I think at this point, given the recent elections. So.
Well, I guess we'll see how it all turns out.
Yes.
Anything else?
Not for me, no.
Okay. Yes. Okay, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.